Hey fellow cartographers, it's Josh with Map Effects, and in today's video I want to walk you through how to draw these rough stone walls for your next dungeon map. This method works really well if you want more of that archaic, abandoned style on the map for your next campaign. Let's start mapping. So the first thing we want to do before we start drawing our dungeon walls is to just rough in the shape of the room that we're going to be doing. So you can just come in here and just really rough in the shape of the room. And for this side, I'm going to have it a bit of a curving arc of a wall. So the way that I like to do that so that your curve is as smooth as possible is to mark the center of the room, center of the arc, and then come in here and just use some short strokes and curve up to that line. And then we can do the same thing on the opposite side. And then we'll put a couple of entrances right here. And we can just kind of erase away what we don't need here. And then we can come up to our layer panel, and we're just going to turn the opacity of this sketch down a little bit. And we're going to create another new layer above our original sketch. And now what I like to do is just really roughly put in the shape of the stones that we're going to be placing. Now the reason for this is, for this technique, you want to kind of intentionally vary the size of the stones just so it has a little bit of an organic feel to it. And I find that if you actually just sketch in some just really basic rectangular or circular shapes, it's just an easy way to make sure that you're keeping good variety. Otherwise, it's pretty easy to repeat a bit of a pattern in your wall unintentionally. So just something like that looks pretty good. And we're going to turn the original sketch that we did off, and now we're going to turn the opacity of these stones down so we can see it a bit better. Create another new layer, and I'm going to switch to a bit more of a dark brown, and I'm going to switch to, let's use this rough tooth brush from the liner brush field kit. And the reason I like this one, I'll turn it up so you can see it a bit better, is it has some nice gritty texture baked into it, which is going to look really nice on our walls. Turn this down a little bit. There we go. All right, so now let's zoom in so we can see a little bit better. And we're just going to follow these blocks that we put in. Just rough in kind of a stone shape. It's good to mix up kind of some more curving angles and some straight angles like that. And the other thing you can do is, I'll come in with my eraser and erase this, and we'll zoom in a little bit tighter. It's nice to kind of put a little bit of a break between some of these stones, and it'll just give it a bit of a more organic feel. And you can actually put some of those broken lines on the back part as well, and that will just help it to feel less like a freestanding wall and more like it's kind of blending into the rest of this terrain. And you'll see how I continue to do that as we progress. And you can see I don't always perfectly follow my original sketch, because as I get going I might have a little bit of a different idea of how I would like to actually blend this to the next stone. So just remember, your sketch is a guide, but you don't have to rigidly adhere to it. Now let's turn our sketch off so that we can see a little bit better. And now it's good to just kind of examine, you know, the angle of these stones and where they meet up and decide if you want to change it up a little bit. I think I'm actually going to on a couple of these because I have 3 rather flat connections here, and I have multiple that are all kind of going the same angle here. So since we want this to look fairly organic, we want to mix it up a little bit. We don't want it to always be going the same way. So I'm going to change it to be going more this direction instead of flat across. And then I'm going to come up here and change the angle of one of these ones too, so that it's here. Let's change this whole part actually. And arguably you could have done this a little bit more in the original sketch, just to make sure that you don't have any obvious repetition to the design of your wall. Alright, now that we have all of these main stones in place, we can come in here and give this wall a little bit of depth, as if you're seeing some of smaller stones peeking out underneath this top layer, and it'll just help this wall to have a little bit more dimension to it. So we can just come in here and use a little bit thinner lines. You can also let the lines break a bit. Try to vary the size of the stone still, but you're just kind of really roughing in some of these rocks just as if they're kind of peeking out underneath this top row, and you're just going to follow the inside of the wall all the way around. The main thing to keep in mind here is you don't want these lines to be as bold. Try to keep them a little bit thinner, a little bit more subtle. You're kind of just adding a bit of a texture and a bit of depth. Okay, and then if you want to, you can come in here and just in some of these little bit sharper corners, like where's a good one? Here's a good example. You can layer in another stone as if there's a row even below this. And you can really keep going with this depending on how tall you want these walls to appear, to give this more and more depth. I think I'm going to stop here just because I want it to be a little bit more of a subtle effect. But now that we have this row in, we can come in here and start detailing some of these stones as well. So the way I like to do that is I like to just particularly follow this inside curve, like that. And actually, you know what? I'm going to turn this grid down even more so we can see better. And you can just follow the shape of the stones and just add some little subtle broken lines on the inside of it, and that'll just give it a little bit more depth and character to these stones. A little bit of stippling if we wanted to, just to get a little bit more of that rocky stonework texture that we're going for. Sometimes it's good to just kind of zoom back and just look at the whole thing and see if there's anywhere that you could just throw in a little bit of texture just to bring everything together. And the only other thing, this is kind of going back a few steps, that I see is I don't like how solid all of these lines are up here. I think I started a little bit too bold when I was starting out, so I'm just going to break up these lines just to make it a little bit more subtle. Okay, and now that we have our main walls done, we want this to look less like a freestanding wall and more like it's within a cave or a dungeon. So we need to give these outside portions the sense that they're a little bit more solid. So the way that you can do that is you can come up here and just put in some other additional stones just surrounding it, and you can connect them to the wall, or you can make them a little bit more floating out here. It's looking pretty good. So now that we have our walls done, I'm just going to come in here and just really quickly draw in some, let's do that again, draw in some floor tiles just so we can emphasize the grid a little bit. Doesn't have to be too fancy. You You can just use some broken lines, and then you can come back in here, just add some details. Just kind of following the grid, and you can just give it a bit of a stonier texture. Oops, I forgot to do this one. Something like that. Then again, you can just sprinkle in some random dots and hatch marks and stuff, and it'll give it kind of the impression of a rocky texture. This is one of those things that you don't really want to overthink. You're kind of scribbling with intention. Okay, pretty happy with that. Now that that's done, we can come in here and just start coloring some things. So I'm going to come up here and tap on my grid layer and create a new layer above that. And I'm going to change, you know what, I'm going to select this background color as a bit of a base. And then let's gray this off a little bit, make it a little bit more gray, and we'll darken it just a tad, see how that looks. And then for this step, I'm going to switch to my heavy marker brush. I like to do this for a lot of my shading. And see how that looks. Let's actually darken this a little bit more. Yeah, it's looking good. All right, so we're gonna come in here and we're just going to roughly block in some color for our stones. And then we can come in here and I'm going to create another layer. I'm going to darken this one quite a bit more. Make my brush larger. And I'm just going to really rough in this area outside of the dungeon. And just because I can't help myself, I'm going to switch to my smudge tool and just kind of smudge this, blend it in with the rest of the paper, just to soften the edge a little bit. If you were working on a full map, you could probably just color the whole outside of the edge this darker color. But since I'm just kind of doing this small section, I'm just going to do that for my own sanity, so it blends a little bit more. Okay, and the reason that we want the outside of the dungeon to be darker is because the eye is naturally drawn to the lightest part of your map. So you want your eye to be drawn here, not out here. This kind of tones this whole area down and darkens it so that your eye will focus on the inside of the dungeon, not the outside. So you can pick whatever color scheme you want. I'm just kind of using a basic age map look for this particular example, just to match the background color that I selected for this. The next thing that we want to do is we'll come in here and we'll create another layer above both our original color layers, and I'm going to change the blend mode to multiply. And let's just test this. A lot of picking color schemes for me is just trial and error, just to see what looks good. So I'm actually going to add a little bit more saturation to this. See what that looks like. I'm happier with that. So let's make this smaller. And the thing that you're going to do is, because these bricks are lower than the top row, we're just going to come in here and add just some subtle shadow to all of these bricks. This just kind of gives the impression that these stones above are overlapping a bit. You can also add some shading to these. Follow the detail marks that you put in the previous step. of look back and see where you want to throw a little bit more color. And actually, I'm going to throw a little bit in here on the floor too, just to add a little bit of shading to the cracks in the floor. It's looking pretty good. And now the next thing we can do is come in here and create another layer. This time I'm going to switch it to, you can either use screen or add. I'm going to use add in this case and switch to a bit of a lighter color here. And I'm going to turn the opacity of this brush down, make it a little bit bigger. I'm just going to block in just some highlights on this top row of rocks. You can see that I'm being, I suppose you could say, sloppy about this. Partly I'm trying to do this quickly, but the other thing is if you're too perfect with this, it ends up looking really digital and fake. But I like to just kind of block in a little bit of color, and then I'll switch to my smudge tool. And the smudge tool I'm using is the brushed edges smudger that's available in the freebie pack on the website. So you can pick up this brush for free and give it a try. Okay, it just helps this top row stand out a little bit more. And then if you want to, you can come back in, and on the same layer we'll turn the opacity of this up a little bit. See how this looks. Yeah, that's looking good. Zoom in so we can see. And you can follow the opposite side of the detail line that you added shadows to and just add a little bit of a highlight as if the light is catching right on the lip of this rock. Now obviously this is all for artistic effect, because normally you wouldn't be seeing the walls from this top view perspective. So this is all for artistic license to make things a little bit more interesting. You're definitely suspending reality a bit in order to make it look good, but that's okay. And then you can come in here, maybe add a couple of just tiny highlights to the floor tiles, just to give it a little bit of dimension. And if you wanted to, once you start adding items in here, and you had torches or things hanging on the walls, you could be using those as more of a light source that casts kind of an orange glow in here, or that if you put a torch or something over here, you'd make this area brighter than it would be over here. But this just kind of gives you a basic idea of how you can add some of these rough stone walls to your dungeon maps and how to shade them in a really basic, simple way that really anybody can do. I hope you found this helpful, and I look forward to seeing your map.